I don't know. Then you can't see the books. I hope that microphone placement is not distracting. If it is, click off the video. Okay, this is a book list I've wanted to make for a little while now. Originally, I was calling it 30 books to read before I'm 30 because I have a significant amount of time left, so I think that I could accomplish some pretty big, important books that I want to read and make sure that I've read before I turn 30. But this book list could also be called, like, the top 30 books that I'm embarrassed to tell you that I haven't read yet. Because that's essentially what it is. Basically, this is a list of books that, when I think about myself as a reader, they are books that I see myself as having read. And I haven't read them. So I'm going to tell you what those books are in the hopes that before I turn 30, I will get to all of them. Let's dive right in because that's a lot of books to have to talk about. I should say before we get into the list that most of my information about these books is coming from Wikipedia, so it very well might be wrong. Do not use this book list as an academic reference in any of your, I don't know, literature reviews. This first chunk of books I am calling Feminist Classics, the first of which is the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas by Gertrude Stein. It was written in 1933. I love Gertrude Stein. I have been racking my brain to try to remember how I got into Gertrude Stein. I don't know if she was assigned to read in a class or if I just stumbled upon her or if it was when I saw the play Gertrude and Alice at Buddies and Bad Times Theatre in Toronto. I don't remember what got me into her. If you know me and you're watching this video and you remember why I started being interested in Gertrude Stein, then please tell me in the comments below because I completely forget. But anyway, I really like her work. I love the idea of tender buttons, but it was years ago that I interacted with Gertrude Stein and I'd love to get back into her work. So this book was written with the intent to make money off of it, but she also kind of inspired a new literary form by reinterpreting the autobiography. This autobiography is by Gertrude Stein, but of her life partner, Alice B. Toklas. Hemingway called the book damn pitiful, and Matisse was offended by the descriptions of his wife, so says Wikipedia. Next up, Orlando by Virginia Woolf, published originally in 1928. It was inspired by the biography of her lover and close friend Vita Sackville West. It's about a poet who changes sex from a man to a woman and lives for centuries and meets key figures in English literary history. I have never interacted with Virginia Woolf and I don't know anything about her books, so I just feel like Orlando is one that I should have read already. Also by Virginia Woolf, A Room of One's Own, 1929. This is an extended essay that discusses social injustices against women, and the title comes from her main point in the book: a woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction. I am a woman and I want to write fiction, so I feel like I should have already read A Room of One's Own. The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. I have this one. This is considered to be semi-autobiographical because the protagonist's experiences with mental illness apparently mirror Plath's, and it was published not long after her suicide. So I think this book and her suicide were associated in interpretations of the book. And the final book for the Feminist Classics section is I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou. It was published first in 1969. I have never read Maya Angelou. I'd really like to. One of my friends said that I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings is one of their favorites by Angelou, so I figured that's a good place to start. It is an autobiography of her early years, and it discusses topics such as racism, trauma, and literacy, so it feels like a good entry point to Angelou's literature. Next up is a section I am calling Sci-fi Classics. Firstly, Kindred by Octavia Butler. This was published in 1979. It's in the style of a slave narrative by an African-American writer who is traveling back and forth in time. Also by Octavia Butler, Parable of the Sower, published in 1993. It's a post-apocalyptic sci-fi commentary on climate change and social inequality. I've seen a lot of people on BookTube reading this one recently and saying how alarming it is, her sort of prediction of what is ongoing with climate change today, so I'm excited/scared to read that one. The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula K. Le Guin. Maybe it's Le Guin? I think it's Le Guin. It was published in 1969. I don't have it, but I do have The Lathe of Heaven, which I will also read, and maybe I'll read this one first since I already have it. The man at the used bookstore said that this one was like her take on a Philip K. Dick style, so it's different than her usual stuff, and the one for my list is definitely The Left Hand of Darkness. Not that I have ever read Le Guin, and so I don't know, but I am excited to read more from her as well later, especially because I do already know I like Philip K. Dick. But The Left Hand of Darkness is the book that really established her as a top sci-fi writer. It is about a human that goes to another planet to ally with that planet, but when they arrive there, they're really thrown off because the culture is very different from their own, because it is deeply impacted by the fact that the individuals there have no fixed sex. Next up, and this one I'm particularly embarrassed to not have read before, is 1984 by George Orwell. This was published in 1949. It is, as probably every single person watching this already knows, a dystopian social sci-fi. It deals with the consequences of mass surveillance and an authoritarian state on society. Now I will finally know exactly what everyone means when they describe things as Orwellian. Also embarrassingly, I have never read Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, published in 1953. In this book, they burn books. Wikipedia told me the books have been personified and outlawed. I don't know what that could mean, but I'm excited to find out. I also think it's one of the shortest novels ever, so that bodes well for my trying to get it read before 30. Next up, again, embarrassingly, it's the whole list, I shouldn't say it every time, A Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. This was published in 1932. In this book, citizens are slotted into intelligence-based social hierarchies, but those hierarchies are being challenged by the book's main protagonist. Next up, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which I always mispronounce as Do Androids Dream of Electric Sleep? Could be another cool concept, I don't know. This is by Philip K. Dick. It's, I think, his most famous novel. It's the novel that spawned the movie Blade Runner, and the sequel to that movie, which came out recently, which I adored. It was published in 1968. It is set in a post-apocalyptic future, and our protagonist has to retire 6 androids, but someone else is trying to save those androids at the same time. I've read one of Philip K. Dick's short stories, and I've also read Ubik, which I really liked. Next is Neuromancer by William Gibson, published in 1984. This is the earliest and best known work of cyberpunk. It inspired the game Cyberpunk 2077, which I would love to play sometime, and the game Netrunner, which I have played. It's right here. Netrunner. Fun fact, it won all 3 of the Hugo, Nebula, and Arthur C. Clarke Awards. And the final book in the Sci-Fi Classics section is Snow Crash. I have that book. Snow Crash by Neil Stephenson. This was published in 1992. It is cyberpunk as well. The main character's name is Hero Protagonist, so it must be somewhat of a parody. And this is the novel that coined the term metaverse, which, I'll be honest, is the main reason I want to read it. This next section of this video is called Russian Literature. Firstly is War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy, published in 1869. It sounds epic and far-reaching. I'm not even gonna try to summarize it. Next is Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. This was published in 1866. It is about a main character who tries to justify murdering someone by claiming that he will use the money he gets out of the murder to make himself a better man. But once he does the deed, he is haunted by the consequences. Also by Dostoevsky is The Double, published in 1846. I'm very interested to read The Double. I think it's quite a short novel, and it sounds like to fully understand it, I will need to first read some of Gogol's short stories, but this book is about a man who is so antisocial that his doctor prescribes him company. So he goes to a party, he gets kicked out, and then in the storm, he discovers a man who seems to be his exact double. Ba, ba, ba. Lastly for this section is The Master and the Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov. It was published in 1967. It is satirical, dark, supernatural. Basically, the devil arrives in Moscow in 1930. It's a city that does not believe in God or in Satan, and he shows up with a giant talking cat. It was actually written around that time too, the 1930s-ish, but it was censored and not fully published until the 60s. This section is titled Miscellaneous Literature. Firstly, another George Orwell that I am embarrassed to say I have not read yet is Animal Farm. It was published in 1945. Farm animals rebel against their farmer to create a more free, equal society for the animals. Also have never read, but literally owned for a while and meant to read and then lost the book again is Lord of the Flies by William Golding. It was published in 1954, and in this book, boys are stranded on an island and try to govern themselves. Next on my list is this guy, maybe the most intimidating book on the list, which is Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace. This was published in 1996, and it is a postmodern classic. It's about a film called Infinite Jest that is so entertaining, people just watch it until they die. Next is another piece of postmodern literature, which is If on a Winter's Night a Traveler by Italo Calvino, published in 1979. This was originally published in Italian. It is a frame narrative, and it's about the reader of the book trying to read a book called If on a Winter's Night a Traveler. Next is 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. It is widely known, I think, as being the first book to fit into the magical realism genre. It's sort of like the foundational magical realism book. I've always sort of thought that I would love this book, although I've never really known what it's about. It says it tells the story of the rise and fall, birth and death of the mythical town of Macondo through the history of the Buendia family. So there you go. Another one, Don Quixote by Cervantes. This was published in 2 parts in 1605 and 1615, and it's basically considered to be the first ever modern novel. So obviously it's something as a novel reader I feel like I should read, and partially it's also on this list because a commenter from like months ago shamed me for not having read classics of modern literature like Don Quixote by Cervantes because I was doing a PhD, and it just was nonsensical that I hadn't read all of English literature if I was gonna be a doctor. So there's that. The next one is not a work of English literature. It was originally published in Japanese, and that is The Woman in the Dunes by Abe Kobo, published originally in 1962, translated presumably at a later date. In this book, the main character takes a trip out of his city to find people who live in deep sand pits, and then he gets imprisoned in one of them. And finally, for my miscellaneous literature section, is Beloved by Toni Morrison. This was published in 1987, and it is set after the American Civil War, and it follows a family of formerly enslaved people in their haunted house. My final section to end off this 30 books before 30 list is called nonfiction, and it kicks off with Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. This was published in 2011, and it delineates the difference between thinking fast, or instinctive thinking, and thinking slow, which is thinking that is more deliberative, and how those styles of thinking interact. It was influenced by his Nobel Prize-winning research with Amos Tversky. Next is a book that I have, but it's way over on my self-help shelf, so I'm not going to grab it, is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, published originally in 1946. This documents his experiences as a prisoner in Nazi concentration camps and his method of finding a purpose in life in order to feel positive about living that life. Next is The Origin of the Species by Charles Darwin. I also own this book, but I do not know where it is right now. It was originally published in 1859, and if you don't know, it is the foundation of evolutionary biology, where he presents the scientific theory of natural selection. And that just feels important, you know? Next, another important book to a particular movement is Animal Liberation by Peter Singer, published originally in 1975. This is considered the founding philosophical text of the animal liberation movement, and it popularized the word speciesism. So maybe I'll read The Origin of Species and the book that popularized speciesism, interesting word. Maybe I'll read those back to back. So those are some of, if not the top 30 books that I am embarrassed to say that I have not read yet, but feel free to shame me in the comments and tell me all of the other books I should be embarrassed that I haven't read yet. Plays, poetry, books of essays, what have you. Whatever it is you think I should have read but haven't, you know, feel free to just tell me about it. Or tell me what you're embarrassed that you have never read. I did want to add one bonus book to this list. This is the one that perhaps right now I am most embarrassed to have never read. So for those that stuck around to the end of this video, here's a treat. You get to know the book I'm most embarrassed to not have read yet. And that is, I've read the prequel. I've read the book that comes before it, but I've never read this. Can you guess? Okay, it's Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien. Never read this. It's set in Middle-earth. The antagonist Sauron created the One Ring to rule them all because he wanted to conquer the land, and the protagonists now want to destroy that ring. And you know what? That's pretty much all I know about it. But I'd like to read it before I start on that Amazon Prime series, so hopefully I'll get to that soon. And it's on this list, so I gotta do it. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that list. Tell me what ones you've read and what ones you're embarrassed that you haven't read. Or not, you don't have to be embarrassed by it. I don't really feel that bad that I haven't read these books. They're the ones that I'd like to get to, because I feel like they would define me as a reader. See you in another video soon!